Welcome to today's webinar, Deep Dive on Amazon Cognito. Our presenter today is Tim Hunt. Tim is a Senior Product Manager with AWS. Today with us, we also have Jeff, David, and Mahesh. They are our team of webinar moderators who will engage with you and answer any questions you have throughout the presentation. Tim, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Hi everyone, this is Tim Hunt. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about Amazon Cognito and how you can use it to manage your users and their identities for web and mobile apps. I've got a lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in and get started. First, a quick summary of the topics we're going to cover today. So I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of an overview of some of the other services in AWS around Cognito for mobile and web apps, give you a little bit of context for some of these other services. Then I'll start focusing in on Amazon Cognito and our identity offerings. I'll go through a summary of those features. I'll pause for a bit and go through a demo to show you how you can set up a user pool and a user pool in action. Then I'll come back and I'll dive deeper into a few areas. I'll give you some pointers for getting started, and then we'll have some time where I'll answer some of the questions before we wrap it up. So briefly, I'll pause on this slide. We're very proud of our customer base and some of the great apps that run on top of AWS. Those apps and our customers come to AWS because of the large number of services we have for building web and mobile apps. There's a few of them here on this slide I'll touch on briefly so you're aware of them. And it starts with the top left where we've got Cognito, and going to be the focus of today's webcast. So this is the identity offerings for Cognito for authenticating your users and managing their permissions. If you've got server-side logic or a back-end that you want to build, particularly in a serverless architecture, we've got Lambda. Another portion of Cognito I won't touch on much today is Cognito Sync there on the middle left. Cognito Sync allows you to synchronize user preferences and maybe progress in a game or an app so that a user can pick up and continue when they move from one phone to another, from one device to another. On the bottom left, we've got Amazon Pinpoint. And Pinpoint allows you to analyze your user behavior and also to run targeted campaigns to reach those users. Then on the right-hand side, we've got S3, where you can store and manage media. And if you want to deliver that media through a CDN, we've got Amazon CloudFront. If you're using push notifications, we've got Amazon Simple Notification Service, or SNS, to offer that service. And if you're storing data, perhaps in a NoSQL database, we've got DynamoDB. And then finally on this slide, we've got the device farm. So if you need to or want to test your app across a wide range of hardwares and OSs and supported service providers, we offer all of those options for you to quickly test your app on that wide range of applications or wide range of devices. So this is a sampling. There's actually a number of others that you'd probably be interested in, but this is a good set to get started with. But because we have so many services, and there's a lot to learn, we've offered something called AWS Mobile Hub, which is a really great way to get started if you're building a mobile app on AWS. So we turn things around a little bit with Mobile Hub, and we ask you what kind of capability or functionality you want to add to your app. So instead of having to know the underlying service, we start with, well, what do you want to do? You can choose from these cards the different pieces of capability and functionality, and the Mobile Hub will stitch together the back-end services that are required, actually set those up in your account, and give you a downloadable, fully working end-to-end app that demonstrates how you can use those services to accomplish what you've asked for. Or you can use some cut and paste snippets to add these capabilities to an existing app. So it's really a great way to get started. So now I'm going to start focusing on identity, which is the core piece of Cognito we're going to focus on today. And first with the proposition that identity is mission critical for applications. It's in many cases the starting point as your users first come in to use your app. And it's critical for the three things I have highlighted at the bottom of this slide. So for authentication, for example, as users can either sign in directly with your app or in many cases, if you want a user to be able to use an existing identity, that might be corporate credentials, it might be the ability to federate in with Facebook or Google identities, lots of different options for authentication to get a user started. Once you've authenticated the user, there's then the authorization question of what permissions are you going to give that user so they can use your app appropriately. So there you're going to think about protecting data in your operations and providing fine-grained access control. And then the third option, the third area here is user management. So that's including managing users when they sign up or when they are needing some help or when they perhaps even are removed from your user base. They're storing and managing profile data and putting users in groups and monitoring engagement. So these are three core areas, and these are also what we would consider our own mission as part of Cognito to make it easy for web and mobile apps to identify and to handle all these three options, or these three areas. But we know actually from experience that building this infrastructure takes a lot of careful planning and is not easy. So it starts with a reliable user directory, and all of this infrastructure has to be highly available. It also requires some careful security considerations for handling user data and passwords and protecting privacy. It requires that your infrastructure can scale when you become successful, and sometimes that's unfortunately an afterthought. There's also a number of standards for tokens that are really helpful for integrating an authentication system with other systems. So getting to know those standards and implementing them. And then also supporting different authentication options, if they're social identities or if they're corporate identities for B2E applications. There's really a lot here to tackle. And we also know, while we think it's critical, we also know that for a lot of our developers, it's really not core to their business. They would much rather be focused on the parts of their business that make, or the parts of their app that make their app unique and make their app special. Starting off by signing in a user is critical, but it's probably not what's going to make your app special. And that's why for a lot of our customers, they've made the decision to use Cognito to provide this kind of identity infrastructure. And in the Cognito identity space, we have two main sides of the solution today. So I'll go through these and introduce them to you. We've got on the left-hand side user pools. User pools are a user directory. They allow you to create accounts with profiles and attributes and store usernames and passwords so your users can set up their own account and they can sign in, sign up directly to use your application. It's a fully managed service, highly scalable, and allows you really to run your own directory easily. And that's user pools on the left. On the right-hand side, we have federated identities. This is the portion of Cognito that allows you to take an authenticated user and manage their permissions or their access to your backend. So these users might sign in with Facebook or through a corporate identity provider that supports SAML. And once they've authenticated, Cognito will allow you to translate those tokens you have from an authenticated user into AWS credentials. That's represented as the keys here in the illustration. So you can control the permissions and the access to your backend. Now, you can use these two pieces separately or together. And I'm going to dive in on the next slide and go into kind of greater detail of a flow that shows how these two pieces can fit together. So it starts with step 1A and 2A, where you've got a user at a web or mobile app. They're going to sign in as what I would call a native user. This is a user that has created an account for your app, and they can sign in with, say, a username and a password, or email address and password. And for that, they would use a user pool. So your app would be using a user pool to sign in a user, and once a user signed in, they get back some tokens. In this case, there's an access token and an ID token, and in fact, there's also a refresh token that comes back. So that's step 1A and 2A, signs in a user, gets back some tokens. Now you've got an alternative if you don't want to use your own user directory, but you want to allow users to use an existing identity. Maybe you want to allow your users to sign in with Facebook, or maybe you're building an app for employees and you want them to be able to sign in with their corporate identity. And that's represented with the 1B and 2B arrows here on the illustration, where you're signing in or authenticating a user through an outside identity provider. But like the first approach, you're also getting back those tokens once the user has authenticated. So now through 1A or 1B or 2A or 2B, through those 1 and 2 steps, you've authenticated a user, you've got the tokens, and you can move on to step 3, which is where identity pools comes into play. So this is Cognito Federated Identities. It allows you to take those tokens from an authenticated user and get AWS credentials that are time-bound and scoped to the permissions that you have appropriate for those different users. So in step 3, you provide the token to Cognito, and Cognito gives you back AWS credentials. And now you can go to step 4, where those credentials, and you can access a backend. You could access directly services like S3 or DynamoDB, or you could use API Gateway as a way of managing access to any number of different backend options. So this is kind of a full stack use of Cognito, both the identity pool and federated identities for the identity pool. And I'm going to show you in a little bit that there are other options as well. You'll see in a little bit that you can skip this step 3 and you can use your tokens from step 1 and step 2 directly with API Gateway. But I'll get back to that in a few minutes. On this slide, we highlight some of the most common use cases that our customers are using Cognito for today. And the 2 main ones are on the top left and top middle. So on the top left, we've got business to consumer or B2C use cases, where you've got your users or end consumers, and they may be signing in through a social identity provider or directly through Cognito as a user pool and getting back those credentials to access the backend, or using user pool tokens to access the backend. And then the top middle, we've got the business to employee or BDE version, where the main difference is how users are authenticated. And in this case, very frequently, you don't want to have your users create a host of other sets of credentials to use your app. You want to allow them to use your existing credentials from their corporate identity. So you can allow them to sign in through an enterprise directory like AD or Active Directory and come in through SAML Federation. So that's the business to employee. And on top right, business to business, this adds the idea of having multiple identity providers for different users in different corporations. So this might be a multi-tenant app. We've got multiple different identity providers, perhaps all SAML-based, that you're managing through Cognito to allow those different user pools or different user bases to use your app. On the bottom, we illustrate a growing use for Internet of Things or IoT applications. There you've got users and you've got things, and you're managing ownership between the two. And on the bottom middle and the bottom right, we've got different access patterns. In the bottom middle, we're using API Gateway to access Lambda. And in the bottom right, we've got, similar to that previous slide, we've got the pattern of getting AWS credentials to access a backend. So focusing some more on user pools, there are 3 main points that we like to emphasize when we first introduced this functionality. The first is the serverless authentication point. So you can add sign up and sign in for your users in a user pool without having to think about server infrastructure. It's a fully managed service, and it's very easy to set up, and there's really nothing for you to manage. Built underneath Cognito is a highly scalable user directory. This allows you to store those user profiles and put users in groups. It scales to hundreds of millions of users. And on the right-hand side, because identity is so intertwined with security, we've got enhanced security features. So both in the way that Cognito is built with best security practices and some of the features, like the ability to verify phone numbers or offer multi-factor authentication. I'll go through some of the flows here for end users. So it's a comprehensive set that can start with users signing up or signing in. Then you can also manage user profiles. So users have, you'll see later, a number of different attributes that can be populated in their profile, and those can be updated. There are the important flows like forgot password or reset password are built in, so users can go through those flows. It's based on token for authentication, and these follow standard like JWT, JOT tokens from OpenID Connect or OAuth 2 tokens. So those standard-based tokens are provided. I mentioned, I think, email and phone verification, but this is an important built-in feature for Cognito. If you have a user who signs up and provides, say, email or phone number, frequently you want to make sure that that really is a legitimate email address or phone number. We've got a built-in capability to send the code to that destination to confirm the user really does own that email address or phone number. And then we've also have multi-factor authentication. So what the way of authenticating a user, where they have to provide another factor beyond the usual username and password. And in this case, what we're offering is a code that can be sent to a user's phone via SMS to really make sure now that the user owns the phone that they provided and linked to their profile as an added layer of security to make sure that they're authenticating and are who they say they are. At the bottom, we have an important note that you can customize a lot of these flows by using Lambda hooks. I'm going to go through that some more on the next slide. So one of the strengths of Cognito is the ability to customize many aspects of the user experience and the workflows. And you can do this through Lambda hooks. These Lambda hooks allow you to insert your own code at different stages. And that can be, for example, as we start here on this slide, customizing the authentication flow. So we've broken down authentication into really its core components of challenges and responses from a user. And with these three Lambda triggers, you can customize these really to great extent to provide whatever kind of challenges and authentication flow that you want for your user. You can also, as I'm moving down the slide, customize and insert logic for things like authentication events. So you can customize the validation before a user signed in, or you can do some event logging, for example. Similarly, when a user signs up, you can do some custom validation. For example, if you insert some code into a pre-sign-up trigger, or you can do some customization when a user is confirmed. And then the last one listed here is the custom message Lambda trigger. I'll show you in a little bit a very simple way of customizing messages through templates, but you can also use this Lambda trigger in a more advanced way to really dynamically customize your communication with users however you see fit. Now, in addition to those user-oriented flows, we've also got extensive admin capabilities built into user pools. So you can, of course, do your typical CRUD operations to create and delete and update your user pools. You can manage the attributes that are in the profiles, including the standard ones and some custom ones. You can decide for each user sign-up which attributes are required. So for example, if you want to require every user has an email address, you can easily achieve that through a setting. You can control the access to user profile information from different apps. I'll show you a little bit about that as we go forward. You can choose what password strength is required as appropriate, whether your app is a more casual app or one where security is paramount. You can enforce different password policies. You can search for users, either full name or prefix matches. And you can manage users with actions like resetting passwords, confirming users, enabling or disabling or deleting or globally signing out a user. So our intent here is that user pool is they're your users, they're yours to own and manage. We're giving you the tools to do that through Cognito user pools. Another set of features which go together to some extent are groups and the ability to map users to different roles. So I'll start here on the left. Within user pools, we've got groups supported, and this is the tried and true pattern for organizing your users into different segments. And also, commonly, this is used for managing permissions of your users. And so we've got a very easy way where you can create groups. You can define IAM roles associated with each of those groups. And IAM roles is the AWS way that you can define policies for those users and very powerfully control what permissions users in each group has to access the rest of your app in the back end. Now, similar to that, on the right-hand side, we've got another way of managing permissions, and these two pieces can work together as well. So we have the ability in Cognito Federated Identities to define a number of rules that allow you as a developer to map different users to different IAM roles. And again, those IAM roles have associated policies that allow you to control access from those different groups to what access they should have in the back end. So you might have a general user group or an admin group or developer group or maybe an engineering group or marketing group, whatever, you can decide. Or you can also bring in external users. Maybe these are users in an Active Directory, enterprise directory, and based on an attribute that you bring in stored in your own corporate identity provider, you can map those users to different roles. So it's a really powerful way of controlling that authorization layer for your application. Now, I said I would come back, I think, a little bit to using Cognito and API Gateway directly. And so previously, when I went through those steps of tokens and exchanging tokens for AWS credentials, we were using those AWS credentials then to control permission to the back end. Now here, there's another pattern where you're using the tokens you get directly from Amazon Cognito with API Gateway and having API Gateway validate and inspect those tokens directly. So we've got two options here. We've got a very simple built-in way on the left-hand side of data support with a Cognito authorizer where you can define in your resources and API Gateway what user pool membership is required to access that API. So you simply have a yes or no, here's a user with a token, are they in the right user pool? Yes, let them through, no, deny. Very simple way of managing permission to a backend resource. We've also got a more flexible and powerful way on the right-hand side here, illustrated as custom authorizers. So these are Lambda triggers that you can use to inspect the token from Cognito user pool, to verify that it is in fact from a user pool and valid and hasn't expired, and then look inside it and see what the attributes are, what group a user is in, to determine in a fine-grained way what permissions they should have to access your backend. So going through a few more of the features I wanted to highlight. There's the ability to control attribute permissions for different apps. So you can choose whether a given app has the ability to read or write an individual attribute that's in a user profile. So this is a simplified example, but it shows here that you've got a custom attribute called paid. So now in this example, you're determining whether or not a user is a paid user, and you can read that attribute on any app because you'd want to customize the experience depending on what kind of a user they were. But here you're restricting the write access so that this app cannot write to that attribute because you want the ability to change a user from paid to unpaid, or actually vice versa, unpaid to paid, as a really highly controlled operation. You don't want the end app to be able to make a change like that. So this gives you the ability to lock down that kind of read and write access for your user attributes. There's also a capability for user pools of creating users as administrator. So you can create users and optionally send them a customized invitation either via email or SMS. That invitation will give the user a username or tell them what the username is and give them a temporary password so they can then come to your app and sign in. As they first sign in, they'll be asked to create a new password that's going to become their then permanent password. You can also, if you want to lock down a user pool so that you don't allow self-service users to sign up, you can restrict it so that only users created by administrators are allowed to be created in that user pool. A few other usable features I'll touch on very briefly. You can customize email addresses. Again, our objective here is to make everything customer-facing yours to customize. If you want to have a design where you have a layer of your own, perhaps server architecture that's in a sense proxying or in front of a user pool, we also add or have added an admin sign-in function that makes it easier from a back-end service to sign in a user for a user pool. We've got the ability to globally sign out users and also the ability to customize the expiration period for refresh tokens. And that determines how frequently a user is going to have to come back and sign in again when they come back to use your app. Now, if you've got an existing set of users for an existing app, one of the things you'll have to think about is importing users or migrating users. We have two options illustrated here. The first is a built-in feature for batch imports. Now, this is based on CSV files, and I'll show you this when we get to the console, but you can download a file with column headers, populate that file, and upload it to import your users. Now, for a variety of security reasons, this process does not import passwords. So each of those users will have to have an email address or a phone number so that they can come back and reset their password. Now, the other option at the bottom half of the slide is what we call a one-at-a-time migration. This allows users to be migrated to a user pool sort of just in time as they come back and sign in. It's got the advantage of keeping passwords intact, so it's more transparent to users, but it requires a bit more coding from you, the app developer, and requires that you maintain your prior identity system for some period of time. So briefly, the approach here is that as a user comes to sign in this migration period, you would first try to sign them in through a user pool. That's that arrow to the top left. If the user doesn't exist in the user pool, you go back to your existing identity provider and you authenticate them there. And once that's successful, you capture the username and password, and you finally create that user back in Cognito user pool so that signed in directly through a user pool. Okay. A couple of words from some of our early customers. So we've got Hixby here. Hixby is one of the top startups in benefit management, and they were looking for an authentication solution that could fit into their serverless approach. And they found that Cognito worked very well for them. The second one mentioned here is Asurion. You might not know Asurion by name, but you've probably been exposed to their products. They're a top worldwide leader in protecting and ensuring devices like mobile phones. And Asurion is an established company that had a large number of existing users, so they're very interested in high scalability. They also had an existing system that they needed to integrate Cognito into, so the flexibility of user pools and some of those Lambda hooks and the scalability were both of the reasons that were really good fits for Asurion. So now at this point, I want to switch over and go through a demo. Give us a moment while we transfer. Okay, great. So now you can see my screen, and I'm going to walk you through how you can set up a user pool in our console so you can see firsthand some of the options you get and maybe make some of these features I talked about a little bit more real. So this is the AWS Services console. Since I've used our own Cognito portion, it's here as a recently visited service, and I can start by seeing our starting page. And just like I described earlier, we have the two halves of our identity offerings. We've got user pools, which has a button here on the left, and federated identities or identity pools on the right. I'm going to focus on user pools here and go in and show you how you can create a user pool and some of those options. First, I have a list of my existing user pools in this region. I'm going to create a new user pool. Let's say I want to give this a quick name so I can get started. And I can choose the option here to step through the settings so you can see all of the different choices that I have. And it starts here with the attributes. So you have for all your user profiles this standard set of attributes. These are the standard claims from OIDC. And these are all available for all your profiles, but you don't have to populate these necessarily with values. You can leave them blank if you wish, except you have the ability to control that, in fact. So we have this column of boxes here for the required attributes. We've got email selected, and I can come down here, maybe I'll add phone. And that means that a user, when they sign up, needs to provide a value for these attributes. So you can enforce always, for example, having email and phone in this case for all your users. Another important feature associated with attributes is the alias feature. And I'll describe this, and I'll come back to it a little bit later in the presentation too. But briefly, what an alias allows your users to do is to sign in with another attribute in place of their username. So very commonly these days, instead of making a user remember a new username, you can allow them to use their email address as a username, so they can sign in with an email and a password. And that's what I'm really enabling right here. So now I'm saying email can be my kind of username substitute. I could also have a phone number in this case as well. Those are the standard attributes. I could add a custom attribute here as well. So let's say I wanted to follow that example. This could be a string or a number, but if I wanted to keep it as a string and follow that example, I could have perhaps an attribute that indicates whether or not the user is a paid user. Control things like the length and whether or not it's mutable or changeable. I'll leave that and go on to the Policies tab, where you get some options first for managing how restrictive you want to be on what's required for a new password. So you can define what the minimum length is, or numbers or characters that are required. So this can suit really the style of your app, whether it's a casual app or an app where security is more important. You can determine whether or not users can sign themselves up, or only users who are created by admins can come into the user pool. And if you're creating a user as an admin, you can also determine how long that temporary password and that account is accessible or will live before it expires after you've created it. So in this case, the users will have to come in within 7 days, for example, to claim that account that I've created for them. The next tab here, the Verifications tab, has some interesting features around both multi-factor authentication and verifying emails and phone numbers. So you can choose whether or not you want to have MFA or multi-factor authentication off or optional for users or even required for every user. And you can also choose whether or not you're going to use the built-in verification of email or phone numbers. So I've got email checked here. I can have phone numbers as well. So this will automatically verify those when a user provides one. And if you're going to use any of the features like MFA or verifying require, sending an SMS message, you need to quickly create a role. That's really just that one-click simple. And now you've given, or in this case, I've given Cognito the ability to send SMS messages from my account. By going to the next step, this is that simple template-based way of customizing your correspondence with your customers that I mentioned before. So you can very quickly in these templates customize the language that you want to use, whether it's for an MFA message or verifying by SMS or email, or the invitation message that you send to a customer if you sign them up as an administrator. But you can also customize the address, the from address, for example. So all of this can be branded as if it's coming directly from your own company, your own email address. If you are managing your resources in AWS with tags, we give you the ability to add tags as well. And we also have the concept here on devices of being able to remember a user's device. So you can choose if users can opt in to remembering devices or always remember devices. And one of the interesting things here is that you can use this in conjunction with the MFA feature to add added convenience while still maintaining a high level of security. So the notion here is that MFA provides an extra layer of security, but if you've already used MFA from a device that the user decides they want to trust, you can allow the user to choose that next time they use that same device, they don't have to use that extra factor from MFA. So now the user gets the added convenience from a trusted device, but if a new device pops up, MFA will again be required to ensure that you do have that layer of protection for authenticating the user. Now, within a user pool, we have a concept of an app. And an app might be something like, maybe you have an app for iOS, or you have a separate app for Android, or maybe you have a North American app or a Europe app. However you want to organize it, you can control access to your user pool through the different apps that you define for your user pool. So here I can say perhaps I'm going to have an app for iOS. I can define how long those refresh tokens are good for before they expire, so how frequently the users will have to sign in. I have a couple of other settings, but the one I wanted to show you again was one I alluded to or I described in the slides, which is the ability to control read and write access to the user profiles. Really the attributes in the profiles. So here you've got the ability to check or uncheck all of these as being readable or writable. And again, given that example I've used, I've got this custom attribute that's for whether or not the user is paid, and I don't want the end user app to be able to determine that. That's maybe a process I'm going to control through a separate flow that involves a credit card transaction. So that's an example of read and write attribute permissions. I can create that app and then go on to the next step. And here's where I can choose all those Lambda triggers that I described. So we've got the pre-sign up, post, pre-authentication, etc. All those Lambda triggers for customizing the flow. Here's custom message for customizing the correspondence with your users. And we've also got those three for defining the auth flow. So the define auth challenge, verify auth challenge, and create auth challenge. You can really simply come in here and choose what different Lambda triggers you want to use at different stages. And at that point, I can go on to the review page, and I could also go back if I wanted to change any of the settings, or I could create my user pool. So to avoid actually creating yet another user pool from just this walkthrough, I'm going to cancel that, but I'm going to go through and show you some of the other things that happen once you've got an existing user pool. And those happen here in the Users and Groups tab. So here I've got a list of the users, and this is an app I'm going to demo in a little bit. You can see I've got a couple of users set up, user 1, admin 1, Tim H. Within each of these, I can see what their attributes are. I can do things like enable MFA or add them to a group. I can see what group that they're in now already, or I can remove them. So I can manage that user here. I can also go back, and I talked about importing users. So that CSV-based option, you can download the CSV header, you can create a job right here, give it a name, give it a role so that we can log the success or errors, and you can just upload the file and get started importing users. Also, if I go back, I can create a user. So this is one way from the console. You can use that admin create user functionality to give a user a username, decide whether or not you want to send them an invitation, give them a temporary password, give them email and phone number, etc. So you can create a user right here. And the other thing I want to show is then groups. So I can see the existing groups that I have. So let's look at this client group. It's got a description and a name. It's got a role on. I mentioned that there's a really easy way to quickly associate IAM roles and permissions through policies, and so I can define that directly for a group here. I can delete the group, I can add users to the group, etc. So lots of options for groups as well. So you can see I can create a group there as well. One thing I'll describe for a few minutes here is this precedence value. So you can have users who are in multiple groups, and precedence gives you a way of automatically deciding which group's permissions to use if a user happens to be in multiple groups. And the notion here is that if you've got groups that have increasing sets of permissions, you typically want to give a user the permissions for the most highly privileged group. So you can manage that by giving groups different precedences, and the group with the highest precedence, in fact, it's the lowest number, so precedence 0 is the ultimate precedence value. Whatever has the top precedence value will be the group that's assigned for that user automatically. You can also, as a developer from the app, you can control that as well, but this is the kind of easy built-in way. So this is a lot of the options you have for setting up a user and groups and user pools. I'm going to show you now how you can see user pools and Cognito identity pools in action. So I'm switching over here to GitHub because we've got a sample app here that is a really great way to get started. You can find it by searching here for AWS Serverless Auth. I'm going to give you a URL later that you can use as well. But if you do this quick search, you'll quickly come to this sample reference app that was created by a couple of solution architects here at AWS. It really shows how you can use Cognito along with API Gateway and Lambda and AWS IAM policies in an end-to-end solution, solving kind of real-world app authentication and authorization issues. So I encourage you to take a look. They've got some good documentation. They've got video that shows an introduction to it, architecture diagram, more description of how this app is built and how it works, some of the user flows that are included, etc. And in addition to that, they have a quick start guide. So if you either click here on the quick start guide or you go back up to the list of files, you can find it there as well. The quick start guide is a way that you can very quickly get this app up and running and then explore how it works and kind of look behind the scenes a little bit to see how these pieces come together. They built this using Docker containers and a custom image at EC2. So really in a matter of minutes, you can get this set up. And there's instructions here for setup, for how you can do it. There's also, by the way, they've done a very nice job of cleanup. So once you're done, you can clean up and remove all the resources that have perhaps been set up in your account. And then in addition to that, they have a number of lessons that you can go through or sample explorations that walk you through a series of questions and pointers to how you can really dive in and understand what's happening and how Cognito and all these other services can work together. So highly recommend you take a look at this. And I'm going to show you a little bit of it here on this other tab. So the sample app is written in Ionic 2. You can use it either in a mobile or a web app. And I'm showing it here in browser, but I've configured it like it's a mobile app. And one of the things they've done is they've output a lot of very helpful information to the console. So I've opened up the developer console here on the right-hand side, and you can see as I go through steps kind of what's happening. So as a quick example, let's say I'm going to sign in here, and they've preloaded the defaults here for a sample user account that's been set up. So I can very quickly sign in. And once that's done, I can see here in the console behind the scenes some of the things that's happening. So I've talked a couple of times about some of these tokens, and they're outputting here to show you the identity token, access and refresh token, so you can see what those look like. And then even gone further to explore a little bit of this user I signed in as user one. See, he belongs to a group called client group. You saw that in the console as well. They've shown how you can look at some of the attributes for this user. And then they've done the next step. So you might remember from the very beginning, I talked about getting those Cognito user pool tokens and using them with an identity pool to get AWS credentials. So you can see that illustrated here as well. So they've used an identity pool and gotten an identity ID for the user. Options are time-bound, 1 hour tokens, or actually keys that you can use, and an associated session token. And to combine those things can give your app access to your backend resources tied again to those specific IAM roles and permissions. So one other thing I was going to show you here was this identity token. So the identity token is an OIDC standard JWT or JOT token. And you can use this in this example to go through and get AWS credentials, or you can use this token directly with your backend. And one of the things that's perhaps interesting is to look at what's encoded in one of these tokens. So I grabbed one of these tokens a little bit earlier, and it's a standard-based token, so you can both verify it and crack it open to see what's inside. And so this is just a sample. You can look through some of the attributes. It starts with a sub or subscriber claim, which is lists what groups that user is in. We have this notion of precedence, which defines a preferred role for a user. So that's what's defined here on this line. Other things like the username, given name, so there's certain attributes for the user. You can see what the expiration time is as well. So it's really interesting to see what's in these tokens. And also in that pattern I described where you might want to use the token directly with API Gateway to make some fine-grained access control through a custom authorizer. This is the kind of information that you could verify use in your own logic as you make those authorization decisions for a user. So, okay, that wraps up the demo. So we switch back over here to the slides. Again, I want to encourage you to take a look at that demo app. I'll show you this URL again later, so you don't have to scribble it down quickly right now, but that's how you can find it. And again, that quick start file is a great way to get started. So now coming back, there are a few things I want to go through as kind of some deep dives in a few features. I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly so that we have time for some questions at the end, but I want to make sure you're familiar with these at some level so that you know where you can go to learn more and you know kind of what features are available. So one thing to understand is the user status. And when a user first signs up, they start as a registered status. And at that point, they need to be confirmed before they can actually sign in and use your app. Now, the standard way of doing this is by confirming email or phone number. That's built-in functionality. So if you use the built-in feature, for example, to confirm the email address, the user is automatically confirmed. But you could also confirm a user as an admin feature or admin operation, or you can have it done automatically through one of those Lambda triggers that allows you to customize the flows. And once a user is confirmed as an administrator, you can choose to disable a user, or going down, you can delete a user. And there are a couple of other statuses on the right which are useful to know. If you import a user over there in the top right, they start with a reset password status. And that means they're going to have to create a password when they first get started. Or if you use the admin create user, they start with a temporary password, but they'll be forced to change that password when they first sign in. So that's some of the user status flows that are important to understand. I've talked about that built-in feature to verify email and phone numbers. So it's an experience illustrated like on the right-hand side where a code is sent to email or to a phone that then the user enters into your app to verify the email or phone. It's worth noting that if your user signs up with both email and phone initially, Cognito will automatically kick off the verification for phone, but you can always come back with get user identify that another destination is not yet verified. You can kick off that flow as well. I've talked about the concept of aliases. So this allows a user to sign in with something other than their username. So if you want them to sign in, for example, as this illustration shows, with email and password, you can use email as an alias. It's important to understand that an email or alias is only usable once a user verifies that destination. So if a user first signs up with an email address, they need to verify that email address before they can use it as an alias. And also that these aliases, since they're used to identify the user, must be unique. So for example, if you're using email as an alias, you can't have two users sharing the same email. You have to have just one user with each email address. Okay, so here's a slide with a couple of pointers to a page we have for helping you get started. It's through getting started guides, links to documentation, SDKs and sample apps, videos, etc. So it's a good way to get started and learn more about Cognito. And now we're going to switch over to some questions.
Great. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. As mentioned, we're going to get started here with the live Q&A. At this time, please respond to the 4 polls that you see on your screen, giving us feedback about how you thought today's presentation went. I'd like to extend a special thank you to the presenters and moderators thus far, and as mentioned, we will jump into the live Q&A now.
Okay, so this is Tim back to answer some of the questions here on the call. The first one here was a question about whether you can only configure one external identity provider per user pool, or can you have multiple? And part of the question here is related to a SAML identity provider, like a Active Directory, for example. And you can have multiple, very many identity providers linked to an existing or to a single identity pool. So for SAML, you can have I'm not sure we have any limit, but it's a very large number if we do. Essentially, functionally unlimited SAML identity providers for an identity pool. Now, for example, if you're using Facebook, they're really easy, only one Facebook in the universe. So you can only have one Facebook. But if you're using SAML or OIDC, you can have lots. Okay, now moving on. There's a question about whether or not there's a user interface for Cognito. And the answer today is that we don't have a sort of standard Cognito hosted user interface, but what we do have is that mobile hub offering that I described. So mobile hub actually gives you a way for a mobile app to create an interface for using Cognito. Outside of the mobile hub, though, creating that user interface for signing up a user or directing them to Facebook is today left up to the developer. Let's see. The next one is Cognito FedRAMP compliant? So not at this point. We've gotten some feedback for a number of our customers that want to use Cognito in regulated industries, so things like for government or banking or healthcare. So we are taking a look very hard at some compliances, and I expect that they'll be added in time, but not today. Let's see. So next question is, how can we manage the app functionality the user has access to? Would the app have to add authorization checking within each function, or is there a simpler way to offload that to Cognito? So today in Cognito, you can use what we call role-based access control to map your users to different groups. So if you are using the AWS way of credentials mapped to IAM roles, there's a very straightforward way within Cognito to map different users to different IAM roles. And so by that, you can control access to the back end. So you can define a role, for example, that has maybe read-only access to S3 or to particular S3 buckets. Maybe you can write to only particular DynamoDB tables. And then you can have a different app, maybe a different role, maybe an admin role that's more powerful with write permissions, for example. And you can define those kinds of permissions in your IAM role policies and then assign those to different users. Another pattern that I've alluded to is the use of API Gateway as a way of controlling access. So if you wanted to do, well, first, you can actually continue that same pattern of using AWS IAM roles, and you can choose for resources behind API Gateway through that same mechanism what APIs can be invoked or not. Or you can build logic directly into API Gateway as a layer of controlling permissions. And I've described before how you can do that, for example, by inspecting what's in the token. Okay. Let me just find the next question I want to answer here. The question here is, can Cognito be used to authenticate users for web services implemented in ECS? So the answer here is yes, if you want to use Cognito identity tokens, for example, directly with your backend. So as I mentioned a couple of times, Cognito will provide a ID token and an access token when a user is authenticated. You can use those tokens directly with your backend, and you can validate the signature as you respond to each request. If you don't want to build that logic yourself, sort of in my previous answer, you can also use API Gateway as a proxy layer in front of your backend and use some of the built-in features to do that for you. So there's a question of why would you use Cognito when we already have IAM? So IAM, we've mentioned a couple of times, works closely with Cognito in order to define permissions for a user. So one of the key things that Cognito does is it allows you to use IAM in a more secure way, which we describe as a best practice, which means you're not embedding your developer credentials directly into the app. So mobile apps and particularly web apps really are not secure. So you could, although we don't recommend it, you could just embed those AWS keys and secret keys to access a role, an IAM role directly in your app. But again, you're putting those sensitive credentials right in your app that way. So instead of that, you can use Cognito to get just time-limited credentials linked to an IAM role. Now you can do that actually, I haven't mentioned this, but you can do that even in an app where you don't have a user that you want to authenticate. So one use case here might be an app where you may be logging something to a Kinesis stream. And it doesn't matter really who the user is, but you want to be able to have that access from your app. We have a concept of an anonymous user in a user pool that you can use to get those credentials, but again, not embedding your own developer credentials, but getting those temporary credentials through Cognito. And then on top of that, Cognito gives you the ability to authenticate users, and for different users and different user types, assign different permissions. So next question here is, can you use Cognito identity pools to authenticate federated users on Amazon API Gateway? Or is there a different recommended approach to do this? So yes, the answer is yes. You can use, for a federated user, for Cognito, you'll be using an identity pool, and you'll be getting AWS credentials for that federated user. And you can, in that IAM role associated with that federated user, you can define what permissions they have to invoke different APIs in API Gateway. So yes, you can use IAM roles that you link to different federated users, and in those IAM roles, define policies that control access to API Gateway.